for joining us for the final session of our series, The Global Potential for American Craft Beer, presented via partnership among the U.S. Small Business Administration, the Brewers Association, and the Virginia Small Business Development Center at George Mason University. Excuse me. My name is Chris Van Orden, with Dan from the SBA and Steve from the Brewers Association. I'm one of your co-hosts for this series. I serve as manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance and International Business Development Programs at the Virginia SBDCs. The SBDCs are a partnership between the SBA and host entities in every state. So if you haven't yet made use of your local SBDC, do reach out. Beyond international trade assistance, they provide a huge range of small business support. So today's webinar is the last in our 3-session series, designed to provide a strong foundation on why and how U.S. breweries can succeed in international markets. We'll be speaking about executing international deals and the financing options available to craft breweries. As in our previous sessions, we've turned off the Q&A and our comments. We have a large audience here and we got a lot of ground to cover. So if you do have any specific questions about your business that you want to get answered, you can always reach out to any of us via our respective organizations. We're here to assist. So now I'd like to turn things over to my co-host, Dan Pichet, National Director for Trade Finance at the SBA, who's going to be emceeing our session today. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you for everybody taking time out of their day to join us here. For this panel, we've decided to break it up into 3 parts. So first, we have Randall Burns from Live Oak Bank, who will be giving an overview on the financing side. We'll be joined in the middle session by Avery Swanson of Keeping Together, sharing her experience exporting and engaging as a brewery and a brand internationally. And then finally, we'll have some comments and remarks related to the logistics and really kind of the mechanisms and ways of getting a transaction done. Since throughout this series, we really focused on the financing side and how American craft breweries are predominantly domestic and how international represents an opportunity, a growth segment for them. We're going to keep this discussion when it comes to financing rooted on the domestic side, where whether you decide to export or whether you're going to be purely domestic, that the discussion here will be just as applicable no matter which direction you go with that. So with that, I would like to welcome our first guest speaker, Randall Burns from Live Oak Bank. Hi, Randall.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Randall Behrens. I'm with Live Oak Bank's Wine and Craft Beverage Lending Division. I helped launch this vertical about 9 years ago. And at that time, we thought we were really going to be more of a wine bank. But it was 2014 and we were right in the middle of a craft beer boom. And we were fortunate to just, I guess, unintentionally run into a lot of great beer opportunities early on in our existence. And beer just became a much bigger part of what we were doing then. And still today, beer is a very large part of what we do. We're one of the most active craft beer lenders in the country. And I think, a couple of reasons why we were able to be so successful there. The first is that even during the boom, we were always pretty selective in who we worked with. We weren't doing a ton of startups. We were, providing really more expansion financing for young breweries who were, growing rapidly and running up against capacity constraints and needed capital to grow. And being that we were the largest SBA lender in the country, we were able to utilize that program to help our craft customers grow. I think the reason why the 7A program works so well for breweries is that it's a very capital intensive industry. And the 7A program allows us to really do 3 key things for our brewery customers. Number one, it provides leverage. For expanding breweries, we can go up to 100% financing. So for a lot of our brewery customers who are kind of reinvesting all their profits back into the brewery to continue to grow, the prospect of putting 30 or 40% down on an expansion project isn't very attractive. So we're able to come in, provide that higher leverage, allow them to grow without diluting ownership and giving away equity. That's very attractive to them. The second thing is longer loan terms. We're able to go out to 12, sometimes 15 years on equipment and leasehold improvements, 25 years on real estate. So having that longer amortization period helps them to sort of keep that monthly payment manageable, which is so critical, especially in the early stage of the ramp up period. And then the third thing is the ability to underwrite to projections. When you're going through these major expansions, the lender has to understand what that additional capacity is going to mean, not only to the top line revenue, but also to the improvement in the margins by having, more efficient capacity. And being, so entrenched in the industry, I think is allowed us to sort of see through that and help some of these guys grow with a forecasted cash flow as opposed to what a traditional lender is going to look for in trailing cash flow. So those, I think, are some of the reasons why the 7A works so well. The reason we're able to provide those, I guess, more creative or flexible loan terms on a 7A loan is because the SBA is there. And what the SBA doesn't actually lend out any money. They provide a guarantee to the participating lender, up to 75% of that lender's potential net loss. So having that guarantee in place allows the lender to essentially underwrite to a separate credit policy that we would underwrite to on a conventional loan. And I won't get too deep into the export activity here, but just real quick side note, a program within the program, the SBA's ITL, International Trade Loan Program, it's an additional credit enhancement for the lender. So as opposed to a 75% guarantee, it's a 90% guarantee in circumstances where we can demonstrate that our loan funds are going to help that small business owner increase export activity. The SBA, in an effort to really support and incent exporting amongst our small businesses, they provide the lender with a higher guarantee. We are never going to do a loan purely because we have an SBA guarantee. Our philosophy is always, look, if this didn't work out and the small business owner failed, sure, we're going to be fine. We have an SBA guarantee, we have collateral, we'll get past it. But there's a person on the other side of that. There's a small business owner, and we are never going to put somebody in a position to fail simply because we have an SBA guarantee. So our criteria is always the same. We are going to work with businesses that we think are going to be successful. And there are certain things that we continue to look for from our applicants, whether it's an ITL or a conventional loan. And that it's not 2014 anymore. So the profile of our customer has changed a little bit, of our craft customer, but our philosophy hasn't. We're still looking for great brands that are well managed and that are in a position to grow. And there's still a lot of those out there. And we're still really, really busy, seeing a lot of great opportunities. We are still fully committed to this space. We're seeing a lot of our competition has fallen off or gone away. We're still here. And I think because of what I spoke to before is a reason that we're still here. Our customers have just been amazing throughout all the challenges that they've had to go through. And, we've been there to support them, but we've got some really scrappy, hardworking, passionate clients, and our beer portfolio has held up really well. So what are we seeing now versus in 2014, 2015, everyone we talked to was going to try to be the next Lagunitas, and they're putting in a 50-barrel system because they want to go over state lines and be the next regional brewery. There are still a few of those out there, but our kind of the profile that we're seeing now is growth within a core market and trying to increase direct to consumer sales, lots of tap room expansion through acquisition. And this is a big one right now. A lot of folks still haven't made it through the pandemic, and we're still seeing some breweries struggle. And some of our stronger operators are able to take advantage of that through acquiring assets, turnkey tap rooms, and then rebranding them to their brewery. And so that we're seeing, I would say, an uptick in those applications. What makes a good application? So when we're analyzing a deal, we want to see good revenue trends. We like to see that the margins are staying consistent. And when they're providing, if you're putting a business plan together for a lender, one thing that we see a lot of is we've got a brewery that's been around for 7 years and they're operating at a 6% net margin. And then we get a set of projections that show them operating at a 30% net margin. Well, you want to kind of make sure that your forecast sort of reconciles with what you've done historically. And we understand that there's going to be some improvement in margin based on efficiencies, but just be prepared, whatever projections you're putting together for the lender, be prepared to sort of explain with simple math how you're arriving at those numbers, and be really specific about where those cost savings are coming from. And look, the brewers that are expanding right now, they're the top 10% of the market. So the applications that we're seeing now are a lot stronger than the applications that we were seeing during the boom. They're smaller, but I would say stronger. So overall, looking at our existing portfolio and analyzing, we kind of do our own internal RMA data based on the financials that we're getting. You can't ignore the rates. Interest rates have gone up. They've almost doubled since pre-pandemic, and that's squeezing a lot of our customers. It's hurting growth prospects. Labor's increasing, cost of goods are increasing, cost of capital is increasing. There are some headwinds, and that's why it's all that more important that the business plan be really well thought out, and that the capital that you're seeking is right sized to the brewery.
Thanks, Randall. I mean, when we were preparing for the panel, I think we discussed some of the transactions that we were working through and ultimately how they get to that point. But, when I was lending to breweries before, it was also how we engaged with the SBDC network and the role that they play. Chris, could you give us a little background on how, an SBDC can help get a brewery ready to go to a lender in kind of the situations that Randall was laying out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The SBDCs, wherever you are, a big part of what they do is preparing people for capital, right? Whether that's going after SBA loans, whether it's venture or private equity, whatever the case may be, making sure that you're making the best case possible. So the nice part is, because we are SBA partners, we know all of the different SBA lenders in the area. We're going to help you to go through making sure that everything's watertight, that it makes sense, that it's telling a cohesive story. As Randall was saying, they speak, balance sheets and being able to look at, previous performance, and then things aren't matching, if things aren't adding up in the head of a lender, that doesn't reflect well on you. So being able to work with your local SBDCs, they may not, not every person within the SBDCs is going to be absolutely fluent in beer the way that Randall is as well. But certainly being able to test the business case and say, is this going to be attractive to a lender, given, the state of the industry overall, given the appetites of different lenders. And they're going to be able to say, hey, we know here are some lenders locally that are having pretty good deal flow, making warm introductions, and just making sure that you have your documents in the best workable condition, so that when it goes in front of a lender, they have something to react to that is going to present things in a strong way. And part of it is also testing to make sure that your business plan is cohesive for your own purposes. I mean, you want to make sure that you do have a path to profitability here, that your expansion makes sense at the scale, whatever it may be. So they may come back to you and say, hey, after looking through all this, you may be attractive, but we think that you're maybe still going to be undercapitalized, or you're going after too much money, or not the right kind of money, whatever that might be. So do lean on the SBDCs for these things. It's a nice way to get a set of eyes on your documents, on your business plan, whatever the case may be, before you go to the lender, and you can feel confident that you're going to be kind of presenting your case in the best possible light.
Thanks, Chris. Randall, I'm just, kind of curious, what are some of the success stories you've seen? Obviously, it's not 2014, the industry's changed. You mentioned that, some of the expansions that are underway now tend to be on the larger end, the upper 10%, if you will. But could you just take me through some, in the audience here, through some of the recent success stories that you've seen and maybe how they've changed from a few years prior?
Sure. Yeah, you're exactly right. The profile and stories have changed, but with the exception of a couple, I guess, high profile projects that we got involved with that didn't work out. All in all, we've had a hugely successful portfolio. And without giving, I can't obviously divulge any specific names, but breweries that we've helped grow from 900 barrels to 40,000 barrels over the last 9 years, and with good margins and putting good, healthy debt on the balance sheet. And even though rates have increased, still, this is reasonably priced capital at really good terms. And we've, one of our customers in the Southeast, we helped him acquire his real estate. He paid $1.5 million for it, and we put a 50-barrel system in his brewery. He's now got 7 locations, and he just got an appraisal on his building at $7 million. We gave him 100% financing. He never would have been able to acquire that property and build out that asset without this SBA debt. And that was actually an ITL deal. We've done a number of them in Southern California, breweries doing, these are regional breweries doing 20,000 plus barrels at strong margins and continuing to grow year over year. And those are some of our healthier customers. And we found that the larger operators were able to really, it was interesting when we came into the pandemic. It was so unfortunate because at that time the narrative was you got to get away from wholesale, right? You can't compete on the grocery store. You got to invest in your tap rooms, and you got to go direct to consumer. And the folks who really invested heavily there were the ones that got hurt the worst during COVID. So I was really proud of our bank and our customers, especially how we responded through COVID to help everybody through it. And I'm going to knock on wood because we're not out of it yet, but it's been just unbelievably successful how they've all come through this. And then as far as the recent success stories, not using the ITL as much anymore because a lot of the requests that are coming in now are more for domestic. And by the way, to go back, Dan, a lot of those customers that we did the ITL loans for, their export activity is less than 5% of top line revenue. These aren't like major exporters, but at the time we loved the idea because craft was growing so quickly and we were such big supporters of the industry. We felt that that's where I think a lot of opportunity was, and I think still is internationally. I was in Italy last month for 2 weeks, and I couldn't find a good IPA to save my life. So I think there is still opportunity internationally to grow craft, but most of our customers are still growing domestically. And these success stories now are, when we say, hey, we're going to help a strong operator acquire a failed brewery, this isn't like predatory. They're not taking advantage. This is good for the exiting brewery as well. To have somebody come in and pay for a turnkey operation versus having some lender come in and strip all the assets, you're getting way more value out of it by selling it to an existing brewery as opposed to going to auction. So we're looking at a lot of those opportunities right now and seeing huge success there. I just did a brewery in the Sacramento market where somebody went in and acquired, somebody put $1.5 million, $2 million into this brewery. They were able to buy it for $800,000 and have a turnkey operation. To build that today would have cost them over $2 million. And they're able to come here, start making beer within a week, and the exiting owner is fine with it because they didn't have to liquidate. So there's, I think, win-wins here. So the success stories, I think there's a lot more of them coming down the road. We're still very bullish on the industry. It's just, it's a different type of profile.
Sure. Well, we could give you a final word. I'm just curious, we've kind of travailed 2014 through the current market. Where do you see the industry going in the next few years?
Like I said, I think there's still opportunity for the stronger operators to grow. I wouldn't mind seeing a little more consolidation. I don't know that we need to see a whole lot more breweries. I think having some of the stronger operators take up more market share is probably a good thing for the industry as a whole. But yeah, we're probably not going to be doing a ton of startups, at least not right now. So yeah, I'm not saying anything that everybody on this call doesn't already know. There's some challenges out there. The younger drinkers aren't drinking IPAs, and they're going towards different product. That whole story's been beat to death. But we're, I think, one of the few lenders that are out there saying we're still bullish. We're still attending all the conferences and the trade shows. We're still supporting the BA, and we're actively looking for strong opportunities to continue to grow our beer portfolio.
Great. Thanks, Randall. I really appreciate your comments and for
you.
joining us today. So
My pleasure.
with that, I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Avery Swanson of Keeping Together. Hi, Avery.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Great. Thanks for joining us here. I know we thought it'd be important to get a brewer's take on kind of export opportunity, how they present, pros and cons, but maybe for those who aren't familiar with you or your background, if you could give us a little overview and kind of summarize your time in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been brewing professionally for a little over 10 years. I got started in Austin, Texas at a small farmhouse brewery called Jester King. Was the head brewer there for several years. I've got equity in that company, not operationally involved at this point, but for a long time there, managed all of the production, managed a fair amount of offsite events, including when and where we were exporting out of the country. I left there in 2019, moved to Chicago, where I started my own brand there called Keeping Together. It's focused primarily on mixed culture fermentation saison, which I know is not as popular as IPAs these days, but really beautiful style of beer and something that I really enjoyed drinking and really enjoyed making. So was in Chicago throughout the pandemic, managed to keep this brand strong during that period of time. Thankfully, people in Chicago are very thirsty, and I was packaging everything in 750 ml wine bottles, which is like a pretty convenient takeaway package format. About a year ago, moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I am establishing a permanent location for the brand, and really appreciated all of the conversation prior to me coming on about all of the different loans and things like that, and how the SBA and the different SBDCs can help people in similar positions to me getting their business off the ground or expanding. I kind of exist in a weird gray zone between startup and expansion, which has been really interesting. There's not a whole lot of content out there on the internet that kind of covers things like this. Going into this, I had not started a business really before, so really have been heavily leaning on these organizations to support and kind of come up with creative solutions to what we want to do. As far as export goes, at Jester King, we were a very small brewery. When I left, we were only doing about 2,000 barrels a year, and had done, Jester King's been around for about 13 years or so. We'd done a ton of export, but I say a ton in that lots of far-flung places, but not necessarily high volume. So like you guys talked about earlier, like 5% of our total volume max, like for us, it was probably closer to 2. But it was one of the most important things that we were doing for the business and the brand, getting that beer in front of, different people in different markets and different palates. The feedback from all of that was really important to us. The relationships that we were able to build with both retailers and importers in other countries was, invaluable to the brand. So with my current project, Keeping Together, we've done a little bit of export at this point, primarily for very specific events, festivals and things like that in Belgium, a bit of export to Japan, because the host brewery where I was making beer in Chicago had an established relationship with an importer that I worked with previously at Jester King. And so that was just a really easy way of getting some of that beer out the door and in front of those palates that I knew would appreciate what I was doing. So very grateful for that opportunity. And honestly, I think it's, obviously margins are not as high as they are when you're selling things through your own tap room, direct to consumer. But I do think that the brand goodwill that you're developing, that intrinsic value in your brand, is worth every penny that you would otherwise lose not selling it in your tap room.
I think it's a really interesting point, right? When most people think of sales opportunities, it tends to focus on top line revenue or, massive growth potential. But what I think Randall spoke to, what you're speaking to right now, is that, export really is, it depends on the brewery, it depends on the business, and some of the value tends to be more on the intangible side. And, you mentioned, your background in mixed fermentation. Just kind of curious your take, in terms of exporting before, what makes for, a good product, or what can be a more challenging point when considering markets or what you're shipping abroad?
Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, I think that with the right partner, you can send IPA that only has like a 2-week shelf life overseas and it will still do well. But again, you have to have the right partner who's willing to, only pick up product that is super duper fresh and knows that it can sell that stuff in the right venues through the right channels in a certain period of time, which would likely include, air freight across the ocean as opposed to ocean freight. Granted, it's going to be more expensive to get it over there, but if your import partner has a plan and can execute on that plan and can tell the story of your brand in a way that, not everybody can do this, you have to find the right partner. But that being said, for me, making mixed culture fermentation beers, these are beers that they're more forgiving generally. They have a bit longer shelf life, packaged with live yeast. And so they're going to evolve over time in the package. If I were to ship it somewhere in Europe and it ends up in a bottle shop somewhere, maybe I don't have a relationship with that particular retailer, but it sits on the shelf for a little while, it's not necessarily going to damage that beer if in 6 months somebody picks it up and opens it. Whereas, if you're sending cans of IPA and it ends up in a bottle shop somewhere where, maybe they've got a really large selection, maybe no one's there to tell the story. No one's there representing your brand the way that it should be represented. Somebody picks up that can of IPA 6 months later, and that's the first time they engage with your brand and taste anything that you've made. That is going to be very much the opposite, very much a detriment to your brand in the long run. So for me, I think the type of beer that I make gives me a little bit more of a buffer. But that being said, with the right partner, you can ship really a lot more delicate beer overseas and it can still do really well.
Yeah, I think what you really highlight is, really the role it can play in kind of developing a strategy, over a long term, developing partners over a long term. The term partnership gets thrown around a lot, but I think it really has to do with, curating and cultivating the right people, right? The right, representatives who are going to help get your brand and product into the right markets. As we kind of wrap up this section, I'm just curious if you could share any examples on how you have developed partners, for those on the line who might be looking at doing the same, and any other words of wisdom that you might have in terms of breweries considering exporting.
Yeah, I found myself in a really unique position when I started at Jester King. One of our managing partners had worked in import for a really long time, Ron Extract he's now at Garden Path Fermentation in Washington. But prior to that, he worked at Shelton Brothers for a long time, which was a pretty big deal, highly curated importer into the US from a bunch of different brands over, in Europe primarily, but also in Asia. And so he had a lot of these relationships already established with people in Europe. But that being said, I would go to festivals with Jester King and I didn't have any of these relationships at that point, but just being present for a lot of these events that are going on, some of the bigger festivals, where I was able to network and meet different people. We went through a few different import partners over the years. Not all of them worked out. Many of them were really great. You have to kind of be willing to be vulnerable, I guess, in a sense, with some of these importers in trusting them to tell your story. But at the end of the day, if they're not doing those things, you need to be willing to kind of, professionally cut the cord on that and pivot. For me, I think being present God forbid, it sucks. You have to travel to a bunch of these amazing festivals all over the world. But being there and telling the story yourself, I think, is absolutely invaluable, not just to your import partners or the distributors or wholesalers or retail partners, but also to the consumer, so that you end up not being just another can or bottle on the shelf somewhere, but there is in fact a story and a face there that people can connect with. And I think that that goes a really long way. I don't know, I would say if I had like kind of one take home message, like import, I've traveled a fair amount to a bunch of different places where I have seen American beer sitting on the shelves, just dying in other countries. And when I see that, it's kind of this like, this was probably a last ditch effort to just like move inventory. And it doesn't have to be that way. If your beer isn't moving in the States, or, perhaps you find yourself in an unfortunate distribution relationship or situation, the answer to that is not necessarily to just like move in mass a large amount of beer out of the country and just like forget about it and like, okay, well, I got my money. Like in the end, you will do so much more damage to your brand by doing that. Export doesn't have to be an afterthought. It can be a very strategic and very specific channel of revenue and relationship and brand building. So putting a little bit of effort into developing those relationships, talking with the BA about, there's lots of detail that goes into export that you don't really know when you're just getting started. Like different countries have very different requirements. So talking to the BA, talking to your SBDC about some of these things, like there are resources out there that can help you with that. But putting together a solid strategy for export, I think, can really be a boon to your brand over time.
Great. Well, we appreciate you taking time out of your day, your morning, and to join us here today. So thank you, Avery.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, we want, with Avery's points about, the opportunity that presents, I think looking at the logistics involved, seems like a good way to bring us into the home stretch here, Steve. So, I know you had some content to share, so maybe this would be a good opportunity for that.
Yeah. Shout out to Avery because she really teed me up for this next section here. I love it. So the slide showing up for you guys?
Yes, it is.
All right. So when it comes to logistics, much of the process is handled by your importer. Beer's picked up at the brewery or delivered to a port, and for many, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind from there. But as a brewer, you're unlikely to be booking those freight services yourselves to the foreign markets or being too involved in the customs clearance. So when at the BA, we're talking about logistics and shipping with our members in the export development program, we focus a lot on the subject of quality and not just quality in production, but quality assurance throughout the distribution process. So, things like physical and microbiological stability of beer happen before it leaves the brewery. It's the brewer ensures that, but once it leaves the brew house, it's packaged. That flavor stability is very much on the trade side. Though as a brand representative of the brewery, you could be vocal about how your beer is treated on that trade side. And the fact of the matter is that exporting requires long periods of shipping and potentially subpar conditions during that shipping and storage. And as you travel internationally, and as Avery mentioned, it's not uncommon to find beer that is subpar, I'll say, on the shelves, not because of that's how it tasted when it left the brewery, but because of how it was handled after it was put on the truck. And so as a US brewer, you have this hard-earned reputation for outstanding, flavorful, and innovative beers. But it's quite easy to destroy that reputation by serving a beer that's been subjected to poor storage conditions. Breweries that cut corners or don't have a strategic quality approach are finding it hard to consistently compete internationally these days as craft beer is growing domestically in other foreign markets. And that's not doing a whole lot for your brand. It's actually hurting your brands and just the category of American craft beer in general. So things like access to cold storage throughout the supply chain is increasingly becoming available in international markets, but not always at the same level that we have here at home. For the BA EDP, quality education for members of trade is a core theme of our international market development efforts, as it is for the industry as a whole. And this is pictured here, a brochure that we designed to provide general guidelines for distributors, shippers, retailers, sales staff, et cetera, on how to better deliver high quality craft beer. It's available in a number of different languages, but really serves as kind of a resource for how to approach those conversations with your importer and shippers to make sure that your beer is treated the way you want it to, so that when it reaches the consumer, it hits that brand standard. And so, we did see an increase in air carrier shipping for exports in the last few years, but you're most likely going to be shipping your beer by boat. Here we're looking at port to port times. This is actually from a couple years ago. I don't believe it's changed too much, but this is for various shipping lines from the east and west coast of the United States. Some of these involve what's called transshipments. So the cargo makes a stop at a port that's not the destination. It's loaded onto another vessel before heading to that final destination. And of course, delays can happen, which may mean you're missing that transshipment window. So, something to consider: how is your beer going to make it to the market, and what conditions will it be subjected to? The good news is that there are solutions to this in the form of refrigerated shipping and thermal blankets that can limit extreme temperature fluctuations and preserve the flavor of your beer. And refrigeration really does make a difference. This is a screenshot from that best practices guide to quality beer. This graphic was put together by Charlie Bamforth of UC Davis, now with Sierra Nevada as their senior quality advisor. On the x-axis, we have the temperature range going up from 0 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. On the y-axis, the number of days it took for that beer to develop on average, a distinct aged character. So just looking at this, 86 degrees, that beer barely lasted 2 weeks before showing signs of age. When maintained at 50 degrees, that beer didn't show signs of spoilage until well after 200 days. And that improves as we utilize colder temperatures. So of course, there's variance here by style and ABV content, but this graph really emphasizes how much cold storage can play an important role in maintaining the quality of your product when it's stored or shipped for extended periods of time. And so just to kind of close this bit, and I think Chris might be touching on this one a little bit as well, but we wanted to share this slide of Incoterms. So these are the international terms of trade. You can find a chart like this pretty easily with a Google search if you really want to dig into it, but they're quite important as they define who takes on the risk and cost of an international sale at different stages of bringing that product to market. So in my experience, most US craft beer exports tend to be shipped ex-works. So that's on the far left-hand side column there. That means the international buyer handles all the freights, pickup from the warehouse, customs, clearance, ocean freight, and everything on the other side. The opposite of that would be DDP, or delivery duty paid, on the far right-hand side. So that means the shipper, the brewer, takes on all the risks and cost of delivering it to the markets. It's rare that I've really seen any brewers shipping DDP, but the option exists. So, it's important to know that the terms of the transaction, as it defines who is paying for what, and certainly helps the logistics company know who to bill as well.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. And yeah, that is, Incoterms are something that we work with all the time, making sure that people need to know these answers when they're speaking with their import partner. I mean, there are issues to raise that some of it is you don't know what to kind of what issues you need to raise with your importer, what discussions you need to have. But I really loved what Avery was saying, is something like kind of holding your import partner to task, saying, being clear about what you need in order to be successful in a market. And if your partner can't provide that, then hey, that's fine. It's no sweat. That's just the way it is. So I have a colleague who says, when it comes to these relationships, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So not addressing these issues on the front end is going to lead to some heartburn a little bit later. So being specific with your import partner about what your needs are. So certainly the quality part of that. Hey, if your product, especially, if your product is not going to be shelf stable with flavors without cold chain maintained all the way through, if your import partner is not prepared to provide that, that's fine, but you need to know that in advance. You can't just count on them to be able to do that. Same goes for things like sales support, right? You know, when everybody's talking about having product that's sitting on a shelf that's, you look at that date code and you just say, oof, man, that's not a great look. Well, what does that look like what are the responsibilities that the importer is willing to bear on that front? Do they have anybody out there checking inventory? If not, then depending on how much you're moving, that may not be the right solution for you. So when we're, some of it is knowing which questions to ask, but also having somebody on your team who's dedicated to this, and kind of, even if you're not even if you hadn't been an importer before, going to the SBDCs, going to Steve in the Brewers Association EDP program to learn the questions to ask. And then just the more you do it, the more comfortable you get about knowing the issues that you need to raise before you sign on with somebody, before you execute a shipment. So that's both setting up a relationship and actually executing a shipment. So I'm just going to go over a couple of these here, and everybody feel free to chime in, in your experience with these. But working with your importer, asking about, the sort of mechanics of the actual shipment. Are we talking, what's the frequency that we're talking about here? What's the minimum volumes we're talking about? Are we talking about a less than container load or, consolidated shipment? Or are you doing a full container, right? That's going to depend, if somebody says, hey, you're the only person in this region, I need to see a significant volume, at least a half a container. Well, maybe you don't want, maybe that market doesn't justify a half container load for you. Or maybe you only want to start off with 2 pallets. That's okay, but your partner needs to know that going in. And so, I think a lot of importers are, have kind of the capacity or building their business in a way that makes sense, that they can attract smaller producers. But it's the question to ask is, hey, who else do you have in your book? What are the different ports of exit that you're leaving from the US? How often are you running those containers? Can I just add a pallet to your monthly shipments? That's going to be a different play than if you're responsible for filling, a container load every quarter. So that's definitely one to be aware of. I'm really glad, Steve, you mentioned Incoterms. That's getting into the real nitty gritty of international trade. And for whatever reason, I really like talking Incoterms with people. But international commercial terms, right? These are not laws themselves, but they're legally binding when included in a contract, and they are attached to an individual shipment. So you can start with one Incoterm with an importer and then transition to another one as you get more involved. Maybe you say, hey, I'm going to start out with the easiest one. They're doing cash up front. They're going to pick it up from my facility. But after a while, I'm going to run the shipment to I'm in, Virginia area. I might send my product to a warehouse at the Port of Norfolk. So I'll be a little bit further along because I'm already running a truck down there, whatever that is. But including that on all of your paperwork, because it's going to affect your pricing, right? You can't just assume that you're going to have, you're going to be able to offer this price. It's going to be full service. Well, what gets included, who's responsible for each of these steps along on executing the shipment. So asking what your import partner typically uses for Incoterms, if they have any flexibility on that, and that you really understand your responsibilities. And I should say insurance is kind of a separate question when it comes to Incoterms. It's not always covered. Then also knowing about some of the costs that you're going to incur outside of the actual executing of a shipment. So I'm sure everybody that's involved in shipping beer here has done some of the stickering things. And Steve, I know you've probably, especially when you're getting products out to all different markets and consolidating shipments, making sure you have a plan in place for like getting your label compliant in that market, right? So that needs to be part of the conversation, because that's a cost that your import partner is going to incur. And how does that factor into your pricing? All of this eventually comes down to a cost. I mean, there's a responsibility, there's a risk component, but in the end, this is a business transaction. So we have to make sure that the costs are being covered, and whoever's absorbing it, that's kind of factored into the overall balance of the deal. And then something that maybe Dan, you could talk about it a little bit about the sort of what terms are we offering here? Are you offering, net 30 terms to your partner? Are you asking for cash in advance for your first shipment? Do you do a kind of 50% cash in advance, and then net 30 for the balance? If you're not going to be getting cash in advance, there are some tools to kind of mitigate the risk of non-payment and things, right?
Yeah, exactly, Chris. And I think it starts with a conversation, and it's not that any, one brewery or one professional at the company has to understand every aspect of it. There's the resources of SBDC, there's logistic partners, association partners like the BA. So, and it's really common for businesses to wade into it gradually, right? There's a reason X-Works is not only, to Steve's point in the table, common for, breweries who are exporting, but, myself and my staff, we work with exporters day in and day out, and X-Works is an incredibly common Incoterm for that reason, right? You've got a business to run. You're not an international logistics firm. The term side, I think that's a conversation as well. I think, the easiest, the least amount of risk is cash in advance. You've been paid. I mean, there's obviously, to Avery's comments earlier on brand reputation and that still exists. That risk is still out there theoretically, but, you're not waiting to collect funds versus establishing a partnership, a relationship with an importer in this case, and understanding their business model, right? And getting references on it. If you are offering terms, credit insurance is a great tool. It's used expansively in the international space, and trade credit insurance, whether it's offered by the Export-Import Bank, so a federal policy, or through private carriers, covers you in the event of non-payment. And it does two things. There's the downside protection, which everybody thinks about, but it also gives you an idea of the creditworthiness. And I think it's that information, coupled with the terms you offered, coupled with your production cycle, can give you an idea of not just your capacity, which you have insight into, but the buyer's capacity and what they can bring on and what you can protect. And that also, to tie it into Randall's comments, I think building that into your projections, having that, if it is part of your business plan, I think and I mentioned this as we're preparing for this panel, like I think it's an incredibly astute move by a brewery to explain how they are going to manage a very busy domestic market. Again, we're talking 2%, 5%. We're not talking that you're going to be a 50% export brewery, but it gives you options. And in a crowded market space, diversifying buyers is, I think, a really good sign of someone who's looking at creative solutions. So, that's the terms. I think the terms are one thing. The more extended terms you're offering, and the more you're offering on term, will impact your cash flow. So that's a good conversation to have with your lender. They have solutions for that, from revolving lines of credit or permanent working capital to help get that piece moving. But and then seeing how that fits into your production cycle will be kind of the two ways to piece those together.
Yeah.
I think there's like a recurring theme here on just not approaching export haphazardly. Do
Right.
your research, take your time. We've got a top 50 by production brewer that I know it takes 2 years to sign on with an import partner from when they meet them. They take their time, they understand the market, they visit the market, and they understand the regulations. We had a horror story at the end of last year where a brewer had a quick opportunity to sell some beer in the UK, didn't realize the labeling requirements and that they couldn't, supply their beer with their 6-pack carrier that they normally have. And so they had the whole brewery team in the warehouse hand stickering cans just to get the shipment on the road on time. They made it happen, but that's a disruption to your domestic operations that you don't want to have happen. So,
yeah, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here. And I think for everybody that just by tuning in today, you're already more knowledgeable than the average brewery on this area. There's a lot of potential out there. There's a lot of value of it beyond just the sort of the boundaries of the individual sale. So do not be shy about reaching out for assistance in this arena. It's, you know your industry well. You don't have to be an expert in international trade to be a successful exporter. There are lots and lots of people like the people on today who have been through this, who are here to support. So yeah, just make sure to use all of your resources and that you can feel confident that you're living with an acceptable amount of risk for your international expansion.
Absolutely. And on that point about resources available, I'll just reference my team again. We have at the SBA's Office of International Trade, we have 20 export finance managers around the country. You can find them easily on our website, sba.gov/international. And I've worked a lot around the craft beer, adjacent to the craft beer space, for a good part of my career. And how open and willing people are to help if you just ask. It's amazing. And whether it's myself or Randall in terms of questions on the loan side, we're available. I just want to at least put that out there as a plug that, I spoke to Randall ahead of time that he'd be able to assist, because that doesn't always lend itself well to a chat on a webinar. But feel free to connect with them on LinkedIn for that, and with members of my team who might be in your local area.
Well, I mean, I think if we're nearing the end of our series here, and it's probably a good time to start thinking about wrapping up and how people might turn around and use this. So if it's all right, I think I'll jump off and start off with sort of some takeaways. So I think some of the themes that we've already mentioned here, right? Building export into your overall strategy. This should not be an afterthought. This should not be distinct and separate, or an excuse to take vacations and write them off on taxes, right? That's a nice benefit when you get to travel, but that shouldn't be a reason, right? This should be part of your overall plan, even if it's not, contributing in a significant way to your overall, top line revenue. It still there's a lot of value to it that can provide to your company, right? If it's, hey, we are an international company, we're getting, relationships with international buyers, we're getting external validation of our quality. You're making yourself more kind of loan worthy, whatever the case may be, making sure that it's baked into the overall plan and that you're defining success in a way that makes sense for you, right? You may have import partners who come to you and say, hey, this is what I can do for you. Make sure that makes sense for who you are as a company, right? You don't want to be compromising your brand or doing something that you're not comfortable with just because there's an opportunity. So I think once you're in this space, now that you're plugged into all the different resources that are out there, opportunities will arise. It's okay to say no or not yet. Do not chase something if it's not the right fit for you. So that's to the idea overall of being patient, making sure that you're allocating resources, right? And this might just be person hours, right? Make sure you have people on the team that are focused on this issue. This doesn't just happen. Make sure that it's communicated throughout your organization that this is important, that you're actually going to go through this, that it's clear where the responsibilities lie on executing these things. And there are some redundancies built in, because if somebody calls out sick on the day of a export shipment, you can't just say, oh, come another day. This is a specialized set of skills that you want to build into your team, but have some, redundancies built in. And like, make sure you're tracking your path to success, right? It may not be immediate, but that's okay. And then I think if I have one major takeaway is, just by raising your hand saying, hey, I'm interested in this space, I've had some opportunities, I want to pursue this, and just get in touch with any of the resources. That's the nice thing. Once you're a part of this ecosystem of exporters or potential exporters, you're going to be connected to everything that's out there. So Steve and his team have amazing resources that are available. The SBDCs are here for you, depending on where you are, your state trade organization, the SBA, the International Trade Administration, there's, Export-Import Bank. There are so many opportunities for you to draw on resources. You don't have to do this alone. If you have already, come back around to us. We are here to support and make you, give you the best chance of being successful.
Just to build on that, Chris, keeping the focus on financing, as we did here today, the skills you gain, what you learn, isn't limited only to the international space. And when it comes to financing, you got one chance to make a good first impression, right? And that's doing everything in your power to prepare for that. And I think that's really a good role that say the SBDC network really plays, right? In helping you sharpen up for that presentation. So that when you bring it to someone like Randall, you're getting right to business. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It is a business transaction. We're looking at the projections, we're looking at history, focusing on the business aspects, and making that solid first impression, I think is absolutely key to a good, a successful application process, and ultimately accessing the capital you need to grow. Steve, any final remarks?
Sure.
Take us home.
I'll close with, I think on a positive note, export can be a really fun way to sell some beer. And as consumer awareness of full flavored beer continues to grow around the world as it has in the United States, those opportunities to get your beer abroad are going to grow with it. But I think what these last 3 seminars have done well is, depicting that doing it in a way that's going to generate orders beyond the initial shipments, beyond that initial launch and splash, does require an investment in staff and marketing, building an export plan, maintaining and building relationships with importers and consumers, to ensure that your brand stays relevant from afar. It's a different game now than it was 10 years ago. We're getting repetitive there, but it's the truth. And so, the BA Export Development Program, SBA, Virginia, SBDC is not here to convince you to export, but we have a ton of resources to help you guys do it really well and get that second, third, fourth shipment going. And so we're here to help. I'm on the phone every single day with brewers answering, simple questions on regulatory issues to evaluating importers in Asia and Europe. So utilize us. We're here to help, and we want to help you guys sell some beer.
Excellent. Well, I think that's an excellent way to drive it home. Chris, you want to take us out?
Sure. Well, thank you all for joining us today and for the other sessions in this series. Everything is available on the Virginia SBDC YouTube. So if you want to share this with anybody on your team or you missed the previous session, just go over there and check it out. Do not be shy about reaching out if you want to know who the first person to talk to is, if you want to find your local SBDC, or if you want to sign up for the Brewers Association Export Development Program, do so. If you're looking for capital, SBA is a great way to go. And we really appreciate you joining us. And I'd like to thank our guests for their time and their expertise. Randall and Avery, thank you so much for joining us for this session. Really appreciate your insights and your experience. So with that, I'll just say thanks again for joining us, and best of luck in your international markets.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.